Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome the attendees to today's webinar titled Jung and the Bible, An Answer to Job. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Murray Stein. My name is Len Cruz. I'll be the host today, and Ryan Deegan will be assisting us with anything technical. I'd like to begin by just going over a list of some of the attendees and the countries from which they originate. As you see on the list, we have people in attendance from Australia, Colombia, Canada, France, Hong Kong, Japan, Scotland, Slovakia, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK, as well as the United States. Our presentation today will be 90 minutes in duration, and let me invite you, if you have questions, please feel free to send those questions in. From your computer, you can do that just by sending them to the email address that you see there listed, ashevilleyoung@gmail.com. You may want to write that down in case later you wish to send questions to us, and we'll have Ryan or myself will pose them to Murray. Let me make just a few comments about the technical side. We advise you to make sure that you've clicked on the correct audio choice in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. You'll notice that there's two choices available, one that says mic and speaker, the other one telephone. Most people will use the microphone and speaker. If you wish, you can use the telephone, and then you have to dial into the number that will be suggested, and then you can move around as well during the conference. But if you use your microphone, please note that it'll be muted initially, and we may open up the microphone for questions, but otherwise you'll mostly be muted during the conference. Please feel free to explore the features on screen. You'll see in the control panel there's a full screen mode that will allow you to see the screen much as you're seeing right now, and it'll enlarge the video presentation of Dr. Stein. We're taping today's presentation, so if you wish to remain anonymous, please make sure to let us know that in your email. I'd also like to just alert the attendees to our upcoming seminar on June 6th. We'll be featuring Marianne Tauber, whose book, The Soul Ministrations, you see shown there on the screen, and that will start at 12 o'clock Eastern Time in the US. Let me go on to introduce Dr. Stein, who, of course, most attendees are familiar with. As you know, Dr. Stein is a supervising and training analyst and former president of ISAP Zurich. Dr. Stein's most recent book is Minding the Self, released by Routledge Publications. Dr. Stein also has a book that's quite relevant to today's topic, titled Jung's Treatment of Christianity. As you know, Dr. Stein currently lives in Switzerland, and we're just delighted to be presenting today's conference. Murray, without any further delay, let me go ahead and turn over the presentation to you.
Thank you, Len. This is the fifth in the series of Jung and World Religions. And what had been scheduled for today has been postponed to a later date. Jerry Bernstein was going to present this webinar on Jung and native religions. But because he can't fulfill this date conveniently for several reasons, we've postponed it to another time and look forward to hearing Jerry Bernstein speak about that subject. Jung's interest in the world's religions, all of the world's religions, is well known and has been featured on these webinars. I started out in the first one speaking about Jung's text, Psychology and Religion, his basic interest in religion, and his hypothesis that by studying the world's religions, their teachings, their practices, their rituals, their symbols, one could gain knowledge of depth psychology that his model was the archetypal substrate of the human unconscious, of the collective unconscious, is importantly represented in all these symbol systems, the world religions and other symbol systems that we have also included in other seminars. For instance, the world's fairy tales, myths, symbol systems like astrology, and so on. And Jung read these for psychological insight and material. And so in our first seminar, we looked at what he had to say in his book, Psychology and Religion, the Terry Lectures from 1937, where he spoke about natural symbols, he spoke about primary religious experience, authentic religious experience, and he laid out his idea that there is a process going on in the unconscious that resembles a spiritual development that one can find echoes of and parallels in various practices in the world's religions. So actually the process of delving into the unconscious and unearthing the deeper layers of the unconscious has a spiritual aspect to it, and in the sense that it connects our consciousness with the symbols of the collective unconscious, serves a function and a purpose similar to what religions serve in offering their symbol systems to their participants. That was the first kind of general introduction to Jung and religion, psychology and religion. And the second one, I spoke about Jung and Christianity. Jung's own background religious tradition was Christianity. His father was a Christian pastor in the Swiss Protestant Church. His grandfather and his mother's side similarly so. Had 6 uncles who were Protestant ministers. So he was steeped in Protestant version of Christianity. And in the course of his life, of course, he also expanded his knowledge and interest into other denominations of Christianity, and went out from there, of course, also, as we know, into all the world's religions, appreciating them all and reflecting deeply on all that he could lay his hands on. In a letter to Victor White, Jung is responding to an essay that Victor White wrote about faith. Victor White was a Roman Catholic priest, lived in England, struck up a relationship with Jung in 1945, and there's a published correspondence between them. And in one of these letters, Jung wrote that he had read Victor White's essay on faith, and he said, your essay caused me to ask myself the question, do I have faith or do I not have faith? I have a hard time with this question, he said, because it's always been very hard for me to believe. I have to know. And he answered White, he said, what came to me was, I don't know if I have faith or not, but I have respect. I have respect for the doctrines and teachings of Christianity, its dogmas, its symbols. Respect is the word Jung used. And then he goes on to say, but it is no different than the respect I have for other religions of the world, for Buddhism, for Hinduism, for the belief systems of the natural peoples of the world, and so on. And he learned from all of them, he respected all of them, and he put his own religious tradition, Christianity, more or less on a par with them. In other words, he was not a true believer in any of them, but culturally speaking, he was deeply embedded in the Christian tradition, in the biblical tradition, and that's what I want to speak about today, substituting for Jerry Bernstein's planned webinar on Jung's study and appreciation of what we call native religions. And Jerry Bernstein is an expert on the Navajo of North America, and and has written several important essays and a book taking up the subject of what we can learn from the native religious traditions. And then we also had a webinar on Jung and Eastern religions, where we looked into a number of essays, interpretive essays that Jung wrote about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, about the I Ching and other texts from Eastern religious traditions. And Jung was deeply influenced by many of their concepts from Taoism. He was very favorably inclined to the idea of the yin-yang symbol as a symbol of wholeness, holding together the opposites of light and dark, the masculine, feminine, yin and yang, symbols of Chinese thought. And he also, from the I Ching, was very impressed by how the Chinese read coincidences as meaningful, and his theory of synchronicity fit very nicely into that picture. And from The Secret of the Golden Flower, a Chinese alchemy text, he saw parallels to the individuation process as he had experienced it in his own life and in his practice with patients in Europe. And this deeply impressed him, and he wove together a number of terms from these Eastern religions, concepts he brought in and into his psychology, and wove them together with his own Western perspectives. And so in the end, his analytical psychology became a kind of conglomerate of world traditions, perspectives from many traditions, but all taken from a psychological point of view. And that's what I'm going to talk about today in Jung's Answer to Job, which is an interpretation of the Bible, a kind of confrontation or encounter, what he would call an Auseinandersetzung, a deeply personal and emotional, as well as intellectual, coming to terms with and reflection on the Bible, the biblical story, and the biblical God image in a psychological fashion, but also a deeply personal fashion. Very controversial book that he wrote. And Answer to Job was, in some sense, a kind of summation of many thoughts and ideas that he'd had previously that one can find in other texts, importantly in the Red Book, way back in Jung's midlife period. Answer to Job was written in 1952. The Red Book was composed during the First World War, some 25 or 30 years earlier. And there are a lot of continuities in Jung's writings that are more or less summarized, brought together, pulled together in his passionate text, Answer to Job. And I say a passionate text because of the tone of it and the way it was written. And I will say a few words about the history of how this work came into being. When you read Answer to Job, I think it's important to keep in mind that Jung is not writing as a biblical scholar. His work is significantly different from what you would find in the writings of theologians. Karl Barth comes to mind as a very important Protestant theologian contemporary of Jung's, who also did read and very briefly reviewed Jung's work, Answer to Job, with respect and appreciation, but certainly criticism from a theological point of view. But Jung is not writing as a theologian. He's not writing as a biblical scholar. He's writing as a psychologist, as a depth psychologist, and as an engaged, passionate individual who had been thinking about questions that he raises in this book, Answer to Job, for many years, and offers in his work, Answer to Job, a kind of summary and his interpretation of the whole biblical drama and its aftermath until the present day and looking into the future. So there's a vast sweep of history brought together in that work, and I'll lay out some of it for us as we go along. But I can't go into a lot of detail. We don't have the time for it. It would be a seminar of weeks and not 90 minutes to look at it extensively. I can refer the interested reader to a very good commentary, very detailed and thoughtful, by Paul Bishop, called Jung's Answer to Job, a commentary, published in the 1990s by Routledge. And I don't think that can be improved upon. It's a very thoughtful and careful study of Jung's work, and Paul Bishop also brings Jung's thinking into relation with the German Romantic tradition, with philosophical traditions and Jung's background, and with a lot of other material that's relevant to that work. But I want to keep in mind that Jung was a modern man. And by that, I mean what he meant. That is somebody who is no longer contained within a theological and mythological religious tradition. And by containment, I mean is no longer enclosed within its belief structures and system. He stands outside of it. He looks at it from a detached point of view. He's got another angle of vision than one that you would have if you were a true believer, if you were a member of the congregation of one of the Christian denominations. He's neither a Catholic, he isn't a Protestant, he isn't Eastern Orthodox, and he is a modern man who feels, however, that our Western culture has been importantly and fundamentally shaped by Christianity and by the biblical tradition. One could say the Judeo-Christian tradition, as well as the Greek tradition. Philosophy and science belong more to the Greek side. But the values that we hold in our culture and the fundamental perspectives on life, the way that our culture has been constructed, and what people for millennia have reflected on, have painted about, have written about, and one is thinking of Dante and Michelangelo and the Renaissance and the medieval painters, and the authors of the Renaissance and before and after, all the way back to biblical times, have been reflecting on certain images, doctrines, mythological stories, stories of divine intervention, of meaning-making events, the sign of the River Jordan parting, Moses leading the people out of captivity and bondage in Egypt, the whole story of Abraham leaving his home, David conquering Jerusalem, building the temple, through the story of Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection. All these images and stories and symbols have been carried by thoughtful people through the generations until the present day, such that one can still attend churches and synagogues and hear the biblical story told as though it were happening today. It hasn't faded from the minds of many people, but it has faded from culture. religion no longer has the grip on culture that it had, let's say, in the Middle Ages or even in the 17th, 18th century, even the 19th century. It began to fade. The grip of Christianity on Western culture began to fade before the Enlightenment, as a result of the Protestant Reformation, perhaps the splitting of the Christian consensus, the politicization of religion, the religious wars in Europe in the 17th century, the revolutions, the French Revolution, importantly, which dethroned the church and enthroned the Enlightenment and the goddess reason, the Russian Revolution, which created an atheistic state, the Chinese Revolution, which destroyed religion in China, Christian religion if it was there, but in the West, this has resulted in a situation where, while the churches are still beautifully maintained in Europe, they're museums of exquisite art and very fine detailed statues, the beautiful windows, all of that maintained by tax money of the citizens, nevertheless are very poorly attended. At a recent survey in Switzerland indicated that only 30% of Swiss citizens think of themselves as religious. 30%. This has dropped from 50% only 20 years ago. So it's rapidly evaporating, or like the snow on a spring day. We had a little snowstorm here in my part of Switzerland yesterday. Ground was covered with snow. Today it's gone. So the influence, the grip of the religious traditions on culture in the West is very weak. And as a result, other forces are much stronger. Economic forces, the corporations, the politics, the nation state, patriotism, all of this has replaced what was once a rather single-minded devotion to a cultural construct, religion. And while people may have sort of fond memories of this religious tradition, it's relatively few who intensively believe and are completely still contained within the religious tradition of our forebears. So that was Jung's situation too. In his time, he looked around and he saw that the churches were not very effective anymore, culturally speaking. He himself was not a regular attender at any churches. He did have very close friends and colleagues who were a part of the religious construct or bureaucracy. They were ministers, pastors, they worked in churches and so on. Very important figures, theologians, priests, who were interested in his psychology and had correspondences with him and discussions and so on. But he was much more closely aligned to somebody like Mircea Eliade, or the lecturers at the Eranos conferences in Ascona, Switzerland, that began in 1933 onward, where actually the discipline that we now call history of religions or religious studies was born and fostered. And these were scholars who might have a commitment to the religious tradition that they were studying, but that was not in the foreground. What was in the foreground were comparative studies, interpretations of symbols, motifs, practices, and the purpose of the meetings was to compare various religious traditions on a certain point, such as rebirth. 1939, the theme was rebirth, and There were lectures from Islam, there were lectures from Buddhism, there were lectures from Judaism, Christianity, from many different angles around this topic. And so it was an intellectual pursuit. And for Jung, the study of religions was more of an intellectual pursuit than it was a matter of faith. That said, the answer to Job is an extremely passionate text. It stands out from Jung's other works in that it's not a scientific work in the sense that he's working in psychology or psychopathology or describing analytic process or just patience. What he's doing is having an encounter, a very personal encounter, an imaginative encounter, something like active imagination, resembles somewhat what he did 30 years earlier in the Red Book. In the Red Book experience, just to step back to those days for a moment, Jung says that he would let himself let go of the spirit of the times and go with the spirit of the depths. And he discovered this imaginative faculty in himself and used it. He called it active imagination. It's thinking in story more than concept, with images more than ideas. And he let himself engage with the images that were presented to him. Now, many of those images were not special to him. They came from his tradition, from his readings. There, for instance, Elijah and Salome appear. Elijah is a biblical figure, so is Salome. She appears briefly in the New Testament. And Philemon was a Gnostic teacher. And so these were representatives of traditional knowledge, gnosis, learning. Izdubar is reminiscent of Gilgamesh, was another name for Gilgamesh. So in the Red Book, Jung also is having a dialogue with a tradition and with his library, so to speak, but in a very unusual way. And that's what he does in the answer to Job as well. He has a dialogue with the Bible. He dialogues with, not directly, the biblical God doesn't come to him and speak to him the way he did to Job, but Jung engages the figure of Yahweh in a kind of critical but almost violently aggressive in places, emotional way. And he takes the position of Job. He assumes the position that Job fell into as a result of what God was doing to him. Jung takes the position of Job's very strong complaints, Job's insistence on having his day in court. And that's where Answer to Job starts. 1951, Jung sets out to write a text. He doesn't know where it's going to go. He's stepping into the unknown, more or less the way he did when he started composing what would become the Red Book in his notebooks, the black books. He wants an answer to Job's question. Job's question is, where is justice to be found? Where is the righteousness of God to be found? Is it there? Is God a righteous being? More than being, on the ground of being is righteousness there, is wisdom there, is fairness there. Because Job is suffering unfairly, and that's the way the story is set up. Now, Jung wrote this during a period of illness. It was in the winter of 1951. he was not well pretty much ever after his heart attack in 1944. And he recovered, and he was very active intellectually. He wrote many important books after that, but he didn't travel anymore after the Second World War, didn't travel abroad. He had to watch how he spent his time. He cut back on his practice. He couldn't entertain as many guests anymore. And in the letters you see that have been published, for instance, his letters with Victor White, he's often complaining about lack of energy and poor health. And so this would come upon him from time to time. And in late 1950, early 1951, he suffered a setback. Either it was his heart condition or influenza or pneumonia or something. And during the time of his recovery, which was about 3 months, in the first 3 months of 1951, he allowed himself to sink into a inner space, into a space of quasi-active imagination, and to start writing. Writing what came to him, writing what was on his heart. And what it was a reflection on the Bible. Why the Bible? He had carried a Bible around with him, as grandchildren have told me, in his pocket wherever he went, and in spare moments while riding in the train or whatever, he would read the Bible. He read a lot, read many things, but he was a student of the Bible. He knew it backwards and forwards. He could quote from it, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in German, sometimes in other languages, in Greek. He was steeped in the Bible, and somehow he had to say something about it. And he had to say something that would be so different from anything anybody else has ever said about it. Very creative, but very personal. It's what he really thought. And he didn't pull any punches. He simply let it all come out. Now, whether he edited his original raw text or not, I don't know, but not very much, most likely. And he writes in a brief letter to Aniela Jaffe, for instance, in May 29th, 1951. He's out at Bollingen at his retreat up on the upper lake of Lake Zurich. He writes, so it goes all the time, dear Aniela, so it goes all the time. Memories rise up and disappear again as it suits them. So he's kind of watching his memories. In this way, I have landed the great whale, he says. In this way, I have landed the great whale. I mean, answer to Job. I can't say I have finally digested this tour de force of the unconscious. It still goes on rumbling a bit, rather like an earthquake. That's the way it came to him. It was a kind of spontaneous writing, but based on years and years of reflection and thought. And so it poured out over a period of 3 or 4 months. He had it typed up, probably did a bit of editing here and there, added a footnote or two, but it is not reliant on secondary literature about the Bible. He doesn't consult commentaries. He doesn't consult the tradition, the theologians. He's writing straight off the top of his head, or from the center of his heart, maybe, or both. And he lays it out there. He lays out a vision of history, beginning with the book of Genesis, running right all the way through the Old Testament. The apocryphal books, which he studied, the book of Enoch was very important to him, through the New Testament, through the book of Revelation, and then on through cultural history, theological history, Western culture to the present time. It's a vast scope of time that he covers. And in picking up the Bible, something so dear to his father's heart, to his grandfather's heart. His grandfather Preisberg was a scholar of the Hebrew language and of the Old Testament. He was the Antestes equivalent to a bishop of the big cathedral in Basel. Basel was Jung's hometown, where he grew up and where he went to the university. And this grandfather believed that Hebrew was the original language of humanity, that God dictated his Bible to the writers, to the biblical writers in the language of Hebrew, because that was the original language, that was God's language. And he advised everybody who thought they would go to heaven after their lives on earth to learn the Hebrew language, because that would be the language of heaven. And so he wasn't alone in this belief that Hebrew was the original language. It was a somewhat widespread belief, and that Hebrew was the language of God before the Tower of Babel was created. And it was with the Tower of Babel that all the other languages of the world appeared. None of them, of course, as original, as as grounded in the divine as Hebrew. And he was an early sponsor of the Zionist ideas that the Jews had a claim on the Holy Land and they could go back and settle in Palestine. The first Zionist conference was held in Basel in the late 1890s. He had died by that time, but Jung was a student at the university at that time. And so Jung's appreciation of the Bible and his embeddedness in the Bible was very deep. And now in his old age and in his illness, he was going to have a crack at interpreting the Bible and telling the Bible what he thought of it, kind of a direct conversation with the Bible itself. Now, it's interesting that he would pick up in his commentary on the Bible and place right at the center of it the book of Job. The book of Job is not a book that most theologians would say is the centerpiece or a turning point in the biblical story. It's almost an afterthought that it was selected and included in the canon. Biblical scholars believe today that it was probably not even written by a Jewish author. It was written during the time of the Babylonian exile. It was probably written by somebody in the circle of the exiled Jews in Babylon in the 5th century BC, roughly speaking, after the time of the destruction of the first temple that David and Solomon had built. And the Jews in exile were, of course, suffering from the loss of their dream. The dream had been that they were chosen by God, that they were led out of Egypt by divine intervention, that their prophet and their leader Moses had received the blessing, the special blessing of God Almighty in the desert, brought down the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai and so on, and that they had entered the promised land, and it was a promised land for them, and that the 12 tribes of Israel would inhabit the promised land, and it would be theirs forever, forever and ever. That was the promise, and somehow this was shattered when the Babylonians overcame the Israelites and took the city of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took them into captivity. And so the suffering, seemingly the broken promises of God, must have been weighing heavily on their hearts. And the book of Job seems to come out of that kind of feeling, broken promises. What has happened? We did everything we were told to do. We lived a righteous life as best we could. We aren't perfect, but we would confess our sins. We tried to live by the law, tried to be righteous, tried to do the commandments, so on and so forth. And this has happened to us. Now, the book of Job, we can look at some pictures. Perhaps, Ryan, you could put those pictures up there. I'm just going to run through the pictures that Blake painted of the story of Job and review the story for you briefly. The story begins with the picture of a righteous man who does everything right, who is blessed by God, who has 10 children, 3 daughters and 7 sons, lots of cattle, lots of sheep, and he does everything just right. He is a righteous man. And God looks down on him from heaven, and he sees what a righteous man he is. But a figure called Satan comes along, and Satan is a messenger of God, a spy of God. He goes up and down in the world, spies out what's going on, and brings the messages back to God. Here you see a picture of him swooping up into the heavenly kingdom. There is God on his throne, and Satan, very energetic, very active. You can see him running like an athlete, coming up and challenging God about Job. And he says, oh yes, Job's a very fine man. Of course he isn't, because you bless him so much. But take away your blessings. Test him. See if he doesn't stop being such a righteous man. See if he doesn't end up cursing you and turning his back to you. Stop giving him such an easy life. So Jung says about this, well, this is God's doubting thought about Job. And God, Yahweh, gives in to Satan and says, okay, you can test him. So take away everything that he has, but spare his life. Don't take away his life, and we'll see what happens. So Satan is set loose, and lo and behold, bad news starts to arrive. There's Job and his wife. The messenger comes and says, all your children were at a party and were killed in a terrible accident. Not one is left alive. And another messenger comes and says, all your cattle have died, all your sheep have died. On and on it goes until Job has nothing left. Here you see Satan actually affecting his health as well. He can't take his life, but he can give him a lot of aches and pains and boils and misery. And here Satan is doing that. And Job is pushed to the limit of his endurance, but he refuses to do what his wife says, curse God and die. He bewails his birth, the day of his birth, how awful it was, and he wishes he'd never been born. But he is convinced that there must be an answer to this, and he wants his day in court because he says he did nothing wrong. And he isn't going to say he did something wrong just because he's being tested in this way. Something is amiss, but it wasn't due to any fault of his own. But he does despair. He despairs of his life, his hardship. It's a horrendous, horrific trial that he goes through. And he has some so-called friends and comforters, 3 friends who come to him. And the book of Job is largely filled with their speculations. They say God is totally just. He doesn't punish righteous people. He only punishes the unjust. He punishes people who've committed a sin, who've committed a crime. Come on, Job, reflect a bit. You're not perfect. You must have done something wrong. Job doesn't understand it. He doesn't see it that way. He says, but I did everything I was told to do. I was perfect in every way. I was righteous. I gave what I had to the poor. I distributed my wealth. I was generous. I obeyed all the laws. I sacrificed to God regularly. I went to the temple, on and on. And these comforters become accusers, and they rebuke him. And they say, how can you be so stubborn? What is the matter with you? God is punishing you for a reason. But this is a standoff, and they go back and forth for many chapters, and neither side can convince the other. And then there is one of the great moments of revelation in the Bible, probably the most sustained self-revelation of Yahweh anywhere in the Bible, goes on for chapters, and Yahweh comes in a whirlwind, and he answers Job, and he speaks to Job, and he demonstrates his awesome power to Job. And these chapters are considered among the greatest poetry in the history of the world. Scholars, Hebrew scholars, and biblical scholars who know about these things say that these are the most beautiful lines written in the book of Job in the Bible itself. They are of a very, very high quality poetry. And for instance, in the King James translation, beautifully rendered. Here you see Yahweh speaking to Job out of the whirlwind. And he says, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched a line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So he demonstrates his awesome majesty and power and the creation of the world, and asks Job, were you there? Did you see all this? So he's showing his awesome might, and in these wonderful lines, also showing forth the beauty of creation, the magnificence of what the earth shows us of his artistry and his craft and his genius. In chapter 39, he says, and these are very famous lines, often quoted by scholars of Hebrew poetry, verse 19 following, hast thou given the horse strength? Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? Canst thou make him afraid as a grasshopper? The glory of his nostrils is terrible. He paweth in the valley and rejoiceth in his strength. He goeth on to meet the armed men. He mocketh at fear and is not affrighted, neither turneth he back from the sword. The quiver rattleth against him, the glittering spear and the shield. He swalloweth the ground with fierceness and rage. Neither believeth he that it is the sound of the trumpet. He saith among the trumpets, ha ha! And he smelleth the battle afar off, the thunder of the captains and their shouting. Here you see a picture of a horse going fiercely and courageously into battle, eagerly, ready to fight. And the magnificence of these pictures that Yahweh paints verbally is astonishing. So whoever wrote the book of Job was a tremendous literary genius, to say the least. And to this day, people admire the work of his hand. And then the famous lines about Behemoth and Leviathan in chapter 41. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? So Leviathan is the great monster of the sea, or earlier in chapter 40, behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. He eateth grass as an ox. Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are as strong as pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. And Yahweh challenges Job to come up with anything equivalent. What can you say, you mere little mortal? And so Job feels, of course, very belittled, very humbled. And in the end, he says, I can say nothing. I am as the dust of the earth. I can only keep silent. So Job is more or less cowed into submission by Yahweh's thunderous response out of the whirlwind. Now, what happens, though, is that after his tremendous outburst, poetic outburst, wonderful, astonishing, glorious outburst, revealing his awesome powers and so on, Yahweh bethinks himself, and I think the text would have us believe that he realizes, well, maybe he made a mistake. Maybe Job really didn't deserve this kind of a unfair test. And he relents. And actually, he accuses the accusers of being wrong. And he says, no, Job was right. Job was absolutely correct in what he said. You are wrong. And he punishes the accusers. Rightly so. The accusers were just talking theoretically, talking projections, talking without knowledge and wisdom, without empirical evidence. They were just spouting off their theories of divinity and kind of cheap grace and so on. Yahweh says they're wrong, and I'm going to punish them, and I'm going to reward Job. So he restores Job. He restores Job, gives him back his family, a family. Job gets a family again, 3 daughters and 7 sons as he had before. He gets great flocks of sheep and cattle, becomes very wealthy. And people have noticed the difference between the opening scene of Job with his children and the closing scene of Job with his children when he's restored, that the 3 daughters now have names. They did not have names at the beginning. Now they have names, so they've been individualized. They've been sort of drawn out of the pack, and they've been given individual attention. So it's an emphasis, perhaps, on the feminine, and bringing that forth into a more prominent position than they were before. Women in those days would have been very subservient to the patriarchal culture, of course. And also, Job is then allowed to live to a grand old age, and he dies a wealthy man surrounded by his children and grandchildren, which is as good as it gets in the terms of those times, probably the terms of any times. To die of an old age surrounded by your family is a blessing. So Job ends up living a very blessed life. What does Jung do with this story? He's scathing against God, who fell for this tempting thought, this doubting thought of Satan. He accuses God of being unreliable, unstable, an unintegrated personality. He gives him a psychiatric diagnosis. We would say today a borderline personality disorder. He's unintegrated. he falls into rages. And then Jung goes back and looks at earlier evidence of this in the Old Testament, where Yahweh would get very angry at his people, sometimes justified, sometimes not justified, break his promises. There are passages that Jung quotes from the Psalms and from other sources that indicate that Yahweh was not steady, as steady as he would like himself to appear. And what Jung says about Yahweh is that unlike other gods, unlike Greek gods, or certainly in the Greek pantheon, maybe not so much in the Indian, some other mythologies, but this God seems to be very interested in doing something with his people. He chooses them, he relates to them, he gets into a covenant with them. Now, he's not a very reliable partner in that covenant. Either that or he can't do what he promises. Either he isn't omnipotent or he's not omniscient, as he claims. And Jung says that he's somehow lost contact with his feminine side, that is, with Sophia. Now, and there Jung turns to the book of the Proverbs, where a figure, Sophia, appears, and she says that she was with God at the beginning of the world, that they are co-creators, that she was his companion, his consort when the world was born. But Jung says she's fallen into the background. Yahweh has forgotten about her. The patriarchy has taken over. Power is more important than Eros. And so he demonstrates his tremendous power in the story of Job, but he doesn't show very much relatedness to Job, although you could argue that in the end he sees the failure that he made. But his making up for the children, the disaster that he created earlier, that he allowed Satan to create, hardly can be recompensed. He doesn't bring those people back to life again. They're gone. Yes, he gets a new family. It's a substitute family. It's better than not having any family at all. But surely God needs to do more than that. And so Jung says, God feels guilty. God feels that he has done something that does not measure up to his own standards of justice and wisdom, and he's going to have to make atonement for that. Tikkun. He has to make an offering that will be equivalent to what he has done himself. And so what he does is he decides to incarnate himself in the human. Now, Jung has a theory of history, a psychological theory of history that he links up to the astrological ions. There's the age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius, and so on. And this becomes a way for Jung to think about these vast blocks of history. He looks back to the beginning of recorded history, the creation of consciousness, you could say human consciousness. And he sees a development taking place in which the foundations, the creative foundations of human consciousness begin to appear in fragmentary form, in flashes here and there, so that you get a development of consciousness, probably as a result of brain structure of humans and so on. And an attempt on the part of the foundational impulses to make their way more and more into consciousness. This is a way of saying that God, who is the creator of the world, is trying to incarnate himself in human consciousness, that the foundations of the collective unconscious, which produced consciousness in the beginning, which allowed for the the building up of ego consciousness over the millennia, over the centuries, which resulted in such things as the achievement of ethics and the law in the Old Testament, the achievement of a philosophical attitude, the achievement of the ability to think and control one's instinctual impulses, an enormous achievement on the part of human beings. All of that came out of this, but there's more to come out. And so gradually over the millennia, there is an attempt on the part of the self, as Jung would call it, the center of the collective unconscious, of the individual personality and the cultural and of cultural history. There is an attempt for the self to become human, to become humanly conscious, available to human consciousness. And this is the motif of the incarnation. That God first incarnated himself partially in nature by creating nature. There's that picture in the Bible. Then he incarnated himself in various sayings of the prophets, revelations, intuitions on the part of human beings, of the archetypal world, world of justice, the world of eros, and so on. The gods and the goddesses are perceived. And gradually over time, there is a dialectical exchange between consciousness and the self, ego consciousness and the self, such that it becomes more and more possible for the self to become fully or more fully incarnated within the consciousness of the collective culture first, and then of individual consciousness, individual ego consciousness operations later. And so he sees this happening in the biblical story. So this movement toward incarnation is a part of the coming into consciousness of the self. And that takes place in a kind of jerky way, and in a dialectical way, such that consciousness can actually get ahead of the game. His argument is that what Job shows Yahweh in this encounter in the book of Job is that human consciousness has gotten ahead of divine consciousness, that it is more conscious, it is more reliable, it is more firmly bound to its structures, its conscious commitments, than Yahweh is. Yahweh fluctuates all over the place. He is very emotional. He shows the lapses and inconsistencies. And so the argument is human consciousness has gotten ahead of the self, and the self needs to catch up. So how's it going to do that? It's going to incarnate itself more fully than it has before. And that's what happens in the New Testament. In the intertestamental period and the apocryphal writings, such as the Book of Enoch, Jung sees the preparation for this taking place, that a Son of Man appears, a figure called the Son of Man. And the Son of Man is a kind of recapitulation of the original Adam, whole man, wholeness, an image of wholeness that was created by the Creator in the beginning, was then lost, and is now coming back into play. And the divine figure, the self figure in psychological terms, is going to assume a more available human form and will try to catch up by also integrating his Sophia, his feminine side, his love, his compassion, his mercy, his sense of justice, which has gotten lost in the story. Now he has to catch up with the human. And so he does that by incarnating in the figure of Jesus of Nazareth, of Christ. And Jung's view of that story is that it is a symbolic story of the incarnation of the self within human consciousness, and that the answer to Job, Yahweh's answer to Job, is that he will assume the same level of suffering that the human did, that he will walk in the steps of Job, and he will go through the suffering that Job went through. He will be tortured. He will be abandoned. He will be hung on a cross. He will suffer. He will die like humans have to die. He will suffer exactly the same fate that he has inflicted on human beings. And in doing this, he will do a couple of things. He will elevate the human toward the divine, and he will bring the divine closer to the human. So there's this coming together of the human and the divine in the figure of Christ. So time and eternity meet in the figure of Christ. Now, the problem with the incarnation in the New Testament, as Jung saw it, was that it remains too mythological. It stays off the ground. It's too ideal. The Virgin Mary is herself virgin born, so that the theoreticians, the thinkers who elaborated the theology of Christianity, wanted to maintain at all costs the purity, the innocence, the absence of sin in any fashion whatsoever from the figure of Christ, so that Christ would be a perfect second Adam. Adam was without sin in the Garden of Eden. Christ is the second Adam. And in order to be that, he has to be created in a way that does not infect him with original sin, the sin of Adam. Adam fell out of the Garden of Eden, had to leave. We're all tainted with original sin as a result of that. That's a theological message. We're fallible, we're at fault, we do wrong, we're corrupt and corruptible. And Jung felt it would have been better if the incarnation had also shown those features in Christ. In other words, it touches on it. Many people have noticed that Jesus is very different, the figure of Jesus of Nazareth, very different from the strict upholders of the law, the purists, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes who lived with strict purification rituals and out in the desert and so on. Jesus wasn't like that at all. He ate with ordinary people. He turned the water into wine at the wedding of Cana. He consorted with tax collectors. He lived with common people and seemed to enjoy that kind of life and association with people. So his feet were pretty on the ground. But as the myth developed, after the stories of the Gospels and so on, and the theology developed, more and more it became mythologized to the point that the incarnation was not complete. That happened, and then Jung looks at the book of Revelation, and he sees a fiery, angry God reappearing. So whereas the epistles of John supposedly also wrote the book of Revelation, St. John, but one doesn't really know for sure. But in the epistles of John, God is love. God, and in him there is no darkness, and there is no hate, and there is no need for revenge, and there is no destruction. It's all light and good. But in the book of Revelation, there is tremendous anger and punishment and splitting. It's a splitting psychology more than one saw before. And so the net result of the process, the psychological process of integration, is torn to pieces as a result of the development and the extreme opposition between good and evil that one sees in the figures of Christ and Antichrist in the New Testament, and some of the sayings of Jesus in the book of John and so on, very castigating, very angry, very destructive. And then the book of Revelation with all of its fire and brimstone, although it ends with a beautiful picture of the New Jerusalem descending from above. Well, the story, as it unfolds through Christendom, through the next 2 millennia, according to Jung, is a story of these opposites at war with each other. And the first age of Pisces, the first stage of the age of Pisces, first 1,000 years, was an age of consolidation of the new doctrines. Christianity came into its own as a result of Constantine, really took over the Roman Empire, built the monasteries, the great theologians of the period, the church fathers and so on, established the doctrines, the councils. So Christianity was set up as a religion of the New Testament, the new announcement, the new message from God of salvation. And that was strongly promoted through the Middle Ages. And then it began to reverse. In the second half of the age of Pisces, you've got a very different development. It's the breakdown of those structures until really it's almost as though the incarnation of evil was waiting to happen in Jung's own time. And this is the way Jung and many people looked upon what happened in Europe in the 20th century. The madness of the First World War, the total insanity of all that murderous rage coming out for no reason. And then the aftermath of that, even worse, the Holocaust, the massacre of millions of people in death camps and on the battlefields of Russia and Germany and throughout Europe and throughout the world. And Jung is writing this in 1952, 1951, looking at the end of the age of Pisces as a kind of incarnation of evil itself. That evil took control of the culture, the opposite of the goodness of God, as proclaimed in the Gospels and in the early testamental period. And now we're at the end of that. We're at the end of the second part of the age of Pisces, and we're entering into slowly, gradually into the age of Aquarius. That's the way Jung is reading the history. And it was incumbent upon people, and he felt this was operationalized from behind the scenes to incarnate as much of the good as they could and as much of the bad as they obviously did. And we have the net result. And it's the end of the age of Pisces, and in a sense, it's the end for Jung of the age of Christianity. Doesn't mean it's the end of Christianity, but it's the end of the age of Christianity. What will come now? And that's the burden of the book, really. I think the answer to Job is what comes now. After reviewing this whole history and the biblical history, and I haven't given you the detail by a long shot. I mean, there's so much in that book. And as I said, Paul Bishop comments on it in detail in his book, Commentary on Answer to Job. Then the question is, where do we go now? It's the end of what was even forecast in the book of Revelation has taken place. It's all over, it's done. But Jung focuses on one detail in the book of Revelation, and that is the pregnant woman who flees from the city of Babylon. And she's pregnant with a different future. And Jung sees that as a promise of what will come after the age of Pisces, after the end of the Revelation scenario. What is that? As Jung looks around, religion is pretty much finished. Mythological religion is finished. In all of its forms, Eastern, Western, as modernity takes hold of all cultures of the world. Of course, there are lapses. There are fundamentalists in every religion who will cling on and on through the millennia, probably to their old texts. But it's outmoded. It's no longer relevant. It no longer speaks to the modern mind. And the modern mind is at a loss, in Jung's view, of how to ground itself. We have all the technology, we have all the know-how, we have science, it's wonderful. We live better than people have ever lived on the planet before, in many ways. Even the level of conflict has decreased. Hard to believe because of what we see on television, but statisticians tell us that fewer people die in war and terrorist acts now than they did in the 15th century, when war was rampant all over the world. But we have all of that. We're enlightened. We have problems, of course, that technology will seek to solve, energy problems in the planet, ecological problems. Those are left to technology to solve. But our big problem that can't be solved by technology and can't be solved by science is a spiritual problem. We're ungrounded in the basics, of spirituality, in the basics of the archetypal world. Now, those were furnished by the religions. Those were offered in the symbols that the religions put out there, and that for some people still work. If you have a compartmentalizable psychology, that you can go to church on Sunday or to the synagogue, or you could live in a kind of closed off segment of your psyche, and you know, do all of that there, and then go about your business during the rest of the week, your secular business. But more and more, the secular world is encroaching on everything. And it's encroaching on our minds. It's not just encroaching on our pocketbooks and on our bodies, it's encroaching on our minds. And this secularization of the mind removes the mythological component, removes the possibility for a sense of meaning. So either we get used to living in a meaningless world and just becoming technologically gifted and more comfortable as we can, and try to stamp out the bad guys when we see them. That's one option that many people would espouse and pursue. But it does leave this spiritual vacuum. And how to address that?
Murray?
Yes.
Can I interject with a question that's very pertinent to this? The question is, we see examples in the Old Testament in which that are related to arguing with God. And for instance, there's the example in Genesis of Abraham arguing with God to spare Sodom, and starting with 50 people, if there would be 50 people that could be found righteous, and then God negotiates that down, I guess, to 10 people. So the question is, when we find ourselves living into the question that the psalmist David posed to God, will you hide yourself forever? Could you comment on what are we to do in terms of the furtherance of our own process of individuation when we see ourselves looking into that black abyss that Jung speaks of?
Exactly, yeah. What Jung speaks of is what he calls the Christification of many. That seems to be his answer, that the incarnation was started, was attempted by, in the New Testament, was attempted. It didn't quite finish the job. It gave a symbol of the job. On a symbolic level, we have it, but on a concrete level, on an individual level, we don't have it yet. And so his notion was that the third age of Christianity was the age of the Holy Spirit, which would be released to humanity, but it was blocked off by the institutional church, because the institutional church wanted to control the Spirit, wasn't so keen on spiritual excess and mysticism and all that. There were certainly exceptions throughout history, but the church was much more keen on keeping people organized and keeping the Spirit at a very low level of volume. And Jung wants to turn that volume up, way up, because
I
he said,
asked Murray, how, just as a follow-up, you have suggestions for how people might avoid the aggrandizement and the inflation that could go with that if you're going to individualize the Christification.
Christification of many. And this is the last paragraph of Jung's answer to Job. He's advocating Christification of many, which means that we all become deified. We all become God-men. God-men like Jesus Christ was a God-man. We all become that. But then what do you do with the problem of inflation? Because the tendency then is to identify with the divine part of ourselves and forget about the human part of ourselves, okay? And then we get inflated. And then he says, what do you do when you have, a million incarnations walking around, each one claiming to have the absolute truth? So you have to stay in touch with the human part and keep a balance between the immortal you in the self part of you and the very mortal part of you and the ego part of you. Keep that related. And that is what Neumann called the ego-self axis. That if you develop this ego-self axis through the individuation process, through inner work, and so on, you can be in contact with the archetypal level, which is what the religions have always offered, in your own way, in your own experience, through your dreams, through your active imagination. But you don't identify with it, but you're in constant contact with it. And so the ego-self axis is an expression for a kind of circulation of the ego around the self, a conscious circulation of the ego around the self, as like the Earth moves on an axis around the sun, but does not fall into the problem of inflation. So you stay human, you stay with your limitations, with your everyday world. You have to pay your taxes, you have to fix your car, you have to pay your children's tuition to college and all of that on the one side. And on the other side, you have access to the spiritual dimension through your individuation work, through the transcendent function, as Jung spoke of it sometimes, or this ego-self axis idea. And it's the next stage of human development. That's what Jung is advocating, that in the age of Aquarius, we will have these kinds of human beings, not dependent on external authorities or sources or institutions, but able to use those symbols if those become important to you and significant, meaningful to you, but in a different way.
Well, Murray, that leads to another question, and I'll read this. Jung refers to Gershom Schlome's major trends in Jewish mysticism, and he does this in relationship to the idea that he refers to as shards, that relates to this admixture of good and evil, such that evil is the byproduct of the life process. And in the footnote, he relates that this life process, I think he uses the term from the Zohar, Sephiroth, had to be cleansed of the evil admixture of shards, and that through this cleansing, the evil assumed a separate and real existence. That's apparently in the footnotes. So two questions came from that. Do we have an indication of the sources of Jung's interest in Jewish mysticism? And the second question, would you comment on the idea that the process of cleansing that life force involves a process that establishes evil as a real and separate entity?
Well, that's a big question. Well, the sources of Jung's interest in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism were several. He had Jewish students around him. James Kirsch and Erich Neumann were important ones, but there were also others. Here in Zurich, there were several. With a very deep interest in, first of all, the work of Martin Buber, which Erich Neumann knew very well. He knew Buber, actually, and he had read his work early on. And Jung met Buber at Theranos in 1934. So Jung was in conversation with people who told him, in letters, you can read this, Neumann says it to him, Kirsch says it to him, you should study this material, you will be fascinated by it. To Jung, that was pretty much terra incognita. He didn't know about the Jewish mystical tradition, nor did very many other people. It was more or less hidden in the shtetls of Eastern Europe until Buber brought it out in some of his works. And Jung didn't pay too much attention to it until he got pushed by Neumann and Kirsch, importantly, and as I say, some others. He then started reading the Kabbalah and some of the other sources. And Gershom Scholem was a lecturer at Eranos. He was one of the very important lecturers in that team of world-class scholars of religion. So Jung was exposed to this, and you see in his later work, especially in Mysterium Conjunctionis, in a chapter called Adam and Eve, Jung weaving together the Kabbalistic material and alchemy, which belonged together since the 17th century anyway, and using that material to discuss these very important problems, such as the problem of evil. Now, what to do about the problem of evil is one of the burdens of Answer to Job, because Jung says you can't get rid of the problem of evil by ignoring it, by saying it doesn't exist, by saying it's a mistake. It's a force. Jung felt that it was an archetypal force, and one has to be aware of it, or become aware of it as much as we can. Now, is it even possible to become aware of it? If it is an archetypal force, we can only become partially aware of it. And Jung's observation was we often do evil not knowing it, not knowing what we're serving. As Jesus said on the cross, forgive them, they know not what they do. These Roman soldiers didn't know what they were doing. They were following orders. So were the Nazi soldiers in Russia, killing innocent people, and in Poland. You think you're doing the right thing. You think you're doing it for high-minded reasons, even cleansing the human race of the Nazi genetic fallacy ideology. And you end up doing horrific evil. In retrospect, you can see it. In the moment, you don't know you're doing it. This is the problem. It isn't a problem we can solve with our heads. Is ISIS evil? They don't think they are. They think they're ridding the world of evil. They want an Islamic State purified and clean, and perfect. So we can't pass judgment on what is evil. We only can reflect on, as best we can, when are we in the hands of evil, and try to avoid that or try to counteract it. Maybe sometimes after the fact is the best we can do. We've done it, and we have to make atonement. We have to do something to make it up, and that's a huge step to be able to do that. So I think the answer to the question, what to do about the problem of evil, is struggle with it and realize it's real, it's a force, it's all around us all the time. And try to join it as best we can to the good. If you can join good and evil, it will minimize evil, and it will de-idealize the good. You know, if you're totally identified with the good, and Neumann's first book was on this problem. He called it Psychology of the New Ethic. If you identify totally with the good, like Job did, obey all the laws and all the rules, what happens? You repress the shadow and you project it, and then you attack it, and you create scapegoats. That doesn't get rid of evil. It just pushes it somewhere else. So
it also gives an interesting twist, doesn't it, to Jesus' words that he speaks when he reads Torah for the first time, that he's not here to defy the law or anything, but to fulfill it. It personalizes it, doesn't it?
Yeah. It isn't. It's not to identify with being the good law abiding citizen totally and only. Because even if you do that and you project the shadow onto the others and attack them, you're serving evil. You're just doing it in a different way. So,
well, it's a wonderful segue, Marie. There was one other question, but interestingly, you answered it. It pertained to Jung's notions of privatio boni, the absence of good. But you've actually put that question to rest even before it was posed. So thank you. But it's a great segue as well into the fact that you're contemplating doing a seminar series in the fall as well on evil and the shadow. Is that right?
Evil and the shadow, yeah. On an individual and collective levels, including criminology and social evil and war and all these manifestations that seem to be operating in our world as they always were, and maybe we can get a little bit of a handle on them.
That would be wonderful. Well, again, Maria, as always, we thank you for an extraordinary presentation, and not only in terms of its scholarship, but hopefully as well in terms of some of the guidance it might offer us individually and collectively. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Let me just remind the audience that our next presentation will be on June 6th, and we'll be delighted to have Marianne Tauber, whose book, The Soul's Ministration, will also be the subject of her conversation with us. So until our next conference, we wish you well. Thank you, Marie.
Thanks, Len.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Wow.